So we're going to begin with Michael Hardt, the co-author of Empire, Multitude, and the latest in this really, really important political trilogy, Commonwealth, all of which are co-authored with Antonio Negri. He is a professor of literature at Duke University and the editor of the South Atlantic Quarterly. And he's someone who is just playing an incredibly important role internationally and globally in advancing discussions of what we mean by social change, by revolution, by movement building. So please join me in welcoming Michael Hardt.
Thanks. Thanks to Scott, and I know many others for organizing this, and thanks to Scott and Grace for writing the book. So what I want to do in a short time is talk about three ways in which Grace is faster to the truth, and do it with contrasts, and centered around really three themes for me that then have to do with the book. The first one about American, second one American Revolution, and the third revolution. So these are the terms I want to try to work through. Yeah, and like I say, with contrast. So I'll in each of them I'll come to Grace, or come to Grace and Scott in the book too, via some others. So here's the first one with regard to American. Some time ago, there was a student-organized event at Duke, at my university, and I think it was sometime when U.S. warplanes were dropping bombs. I think it was over Kosovo, but it could be any number of other places. And so I was invited together with my friend and colleague Frederick Jameson, whose work some of you might know, and Fred started his, they asked us to say a few words about this before we had a discussion about U.S. intervention in ex-Yugoslavia, etc. And so Fred started out by saying, he said, the first duty of an American intellectual is anti-Americanism. And I thought that just didn't sound right to me. But it does seem, I want to say first that it does seem, there's something in a way noble about this, and it has a lovely dialectical formulation. To be a true American intellectual, Fred wants to say, you have to be anti-American. Well, this is what he means, I think, and this is what I think is noble about this position. I mean, in the first, he means by this, one has to recognize the history of U.S. imperialism, history of U.S. interventions, history of coup d'etat supported by the U.S., etc., and in that sense be anti-American. One has to also then recognize, in what would be in such an event like we were, is to recognize the continuity of that, how that's continually happening in each of these instances, and I would even argue in Libya today, similar things are happening. But that would be the in a way, continuity of recognizing the long past of U.S. Imperialist interventions and its continuity to today. And then he thinks of this as a duty, not just for intellectuals outside the U.S. that would recognize and criticize U.S. actions, but really for those most inside it, that's what their duty is. And so in that sense, that's what he would mean by that. And like I say, I have a certain admiration for it, but it just doesn't seem right to me to say that the first duty of a U.S. intellectual is anti-Americanism. Yeah, anti-Americanism, we mean anti-U.S.ism. Certainly not being anti-Bolivia or Canada or any of them or the Americas. But anyway, that's what's meant by it. So in contrast to that, it seems to me that Grace's similar slogan would be something like this, that the first duty of a U.S. intellectual and activist is to love America enough to change it. That seems really different to me. Now, when you hear something like that, from that first perspective, you might ask, well, I mean, has she forgotten what the U.S. is? How could you love something that's so horrible? When you think about the history of the racism internal to the U.S., the all forms of domination, internal, external, imperialism, etc. And I would say, of course, the perspective as I understand it, yes, all that's true. All that's true, but it seems to me that Grace and her work for a long time, and Scott and Grace in this book, they in a way have different glasses. They see a different U.S., and they see a different U.S. history that's full of promise, that doesn't negate or ignore, worse, naively, those horrible traditions, both internal and external to the U.S., but are also able to see a different U.S. and a different U.S. that shows us a different future. So that's the first one about American. Second, about American Revolution. From a certain historical perspective or certain radical tradition, American Revolution is an oxymoron. I mean, today, America, when thinking about it, now I'm thinking of traditions from the 60s and 70s, sometimes going under the name Third Worldism. America is not a revolutionary place. It's the home of anti-revolution. It's the home of counter-revolution in the same way as before. From this perspective, scholars and activists, a long tradition, have held a long tradition, 30, 40 years. The revolution can only happen elsewhere, among those who are most oppressed, and that in the U.S., in North America in general, in Europe, the people are too comfortable, too privileged to actually change the world. That only those who are really most oppressed could possibly have the possibility to change. And this is something when I feel myself a little bit more implicated, I guess. And so let me go through a little bit of what I call it, biographical confessions of my implication in this, and then come back around to what I see Grace's, beeline to the truth. There you go, I like that phrase. So I recognize some of this in myself in my 20s. I was in my 20s, I just graduated college in the mid-1980s, and I was part of a cohort, if not a generation, that seemed to feel that our revolutionary activity, our revolutionary desires could only be met elsewhere. And for my group at the time, certainly not for everyone in the U.S., but for my cohort at the time, it seemed like Central America was the only place to go. Like that's where things were happening and not in the U.S. And so with others, groups of friends and colleagues, I ended up in El Salvador during the Civil War, ended up at the National University in El Salvador, which was a great locus of activism and revolutionary activity. And then very significant for me was one meeting with them. This is something that I've recounted before, and I'm sorry if some of you I've told it to before. But so there was a meeting with these Salvadoran students at the National University, and I was very pleased to be with them and very pleased to be friends with them. And we had a kind of retreat, and at this retreat, they started the meeting in the usual sort of way that, we're really, really grateful to our North American comrades for having to support us and coming here. But then they added, and this was, really to me by my new friend, and he said, but you could really help us much more by going home to the U.S. and making revolution there. And I was like, oh, fuck, Reagan had just been elected again. It seemed absolutely impossible. I had no idea what he was talking about, And so I said that. I said, why? I don't know what to do. And he looked at me like incredulous, and he said, well, don't you all have mountains there? And I said, yeah, we got mountains. And he said, it's easy. You go to the mountains, you make an armed band, and you make revolution. It's not that hard. And so there are two things I got out of this. One was eventually, I was traumatized for a while. So one thing I recognized was how hard it was for me, and I think for, I want to say my generation, but there were many smarter than me in my generation, let's say my cohort. It was so hard for us to imagine revolution in the U.S. It just seemed unimaginable at the time. To us, that's what I say. And the second thing I recognized was how different a revolution in the U.S. had to be than what was going on at the time in El Salvador. I'm not even convinced that for them it was as simple as going to the mountains and forming the armed band. But certainly for us, I was in Washington State at the time. There were a lot of crazies in the mountains with guns. That was not what I imagined as what we could do. So in my own strange, it didn't lead me in the late 1980s to go back to the U.S. and make revolution there because like I said, I was not smart enough. So I ended up going to Paris, and really it was through Italian and French intellectuals that I learned about the history of the history of revolutionary activity in the U.S. It was strangely enough that I had to learn through these French and Italians the history of the organizing of the IWW. I had to learn about drum in Detroit through them. I had to learn about black revolutionary workers through them. I had to learn about Jimmy and Grace's work through the French and Italians about C.L.R. James, etc. So I got that education of what the U.S. was and could be only through this circuitous route. Like I say, Grace didn't have to go through that circuitous route. She was much more direct in this, and it seems to me that she's not only witnessed and lived, and now in this book and in her other writings too, described a kind of continuous revolutionary activity, a continuous revolutionary America that is that you have to put on the right glasses to see. That's what I want to say, something like that. And that it took me a good 40 years to get around to it. It took me a long time. Okay, so the third one, this was American Revolution, and now it's just Revolution. Do I have another minute?
Oh, you've got 5.
Okay, good, thanks. 5 is perfect. So what is this revolution? Like, what would revolution mean in this context? There's some tradition by which revolution would focus on the overthrow of state power, but of course we know that maintaining the same social structure, which is new people in power, that doesn't really mean very much. There's another tradition or extension of that tradition that would think about the transformation of the mode of production, the transformation of the relations of production, essentially anti-capitalist traditions, communist traditions. And yes, that too is important. It seems to me that Grace is more interested in the transformation of subjectivity, in the changing of who we are. And in that sense, in continuity with some of the aspects of the Cultural Revolution that were part of the previous panel. Now, when we say that, like revolution is transformation of subjectivity, changing who we are, that doesn't mean just that we as individuals need to think different, like that we need to have different ideas, like, oh, it's easy to do the revolution, just change who you are, change who you think. No, that's not it. That's clearly not it. What it is rather, and this is now I'm really getting into what seems to me some of the core of the book, is that the transformation of subjectivity only happens through collective material practices, through community organizing, and for Grace it's always been through extremely local community organizing. The chapter on Detroit in the book seems to me in some ways the core of this, that we change who we are together through material practices, through collective organizing. Now, yeah, the tradition, let's say, intellectual touchstones for me that fill out or correspond with this notion about revolution. Well, at least one point of it goes to a passage in Lenin's book, State and Revolution, written right on the eve of the Soviet Revolution, in which Lenin writes something like this. Lenin writes, workers and peasants, Russian workers and peasants as they are today, they have a boss at work, and so they need a boss in politics. You could try to put them in charge of themselves. You could try to immediately institute democracy and abolish the state, but it wouldn't make any sense because who people are today, this is what they know how to do. They know how to obey orders because that's what they've been practiced in. He says what you need to do is you need a new human nature that would be composed of new habits and really new capacities. And so what revolution, this is what I like about this kind of idea, is that what revolution consists of is really a transformation of human nature. So it's not just who we are, like think different. That would sound more like an Apple computer ad or something like that. It's more that we have to actually transform human nature, meaning that we have to transform the habits and practices of who we are, that we have to become different. So in this sense, the nice version of revolution, the nice way of thinking about revolution, the way it makes you feel happy thinking about revolution, is you recognize how horrible this world is and you think, oh, we're going to make revolution and we're going to make the world in which we finally fit. And I think that's really wrong. I think what revolution really is creating a world in which we really don't fit, in which we would have to be completely different in order to survive. Like, it's in that way that I think revolution's really for monsters. Like that, and I mean this in a nice way, but it's also horrifying that what revolution's about is about a way of really losing who you are and transforming who you are into becoming something and someone different. That transformation of human nature, I think, is a really terrifying and in that sense also exciting prospect. It's monstrous. It's monstrous in that way. Okay, Grace, of course, is more interested in the practical and the local, and the ways, in a way that we can see right before us, the ways that we are already even transforming human nature through new practices and through a whole long tradition of new practices in which we fit, in which we could transform this. So that's where I come to the end, so that instead of what seems to me a noble but for me finally mistaken notion that the first duty of a U.S. intellectual is to be anti-American, I think Grace's mandate is something different, that the first duty of a U.S. intellectual and U.S. activist is to make the next American revolution. That's all I have. Thanks.